There is a particular kind of silence that lives in a house after midnight. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of a family at rest. Something thinner than that, something with edges. The refrigerator hum. The occasional tick of the heating system contracting in the walls. The sound of your own breathing, which you only notice when everything else has stopped. I had learned to sleep through that silence years ago, the way you learn to sleep through anything that becomes routine. But in the last weeks of that autumn, I had stopped sleeping through it. I had started sitting with it instead. In the kitchen, with the lights off and a glass of water I didn't drink, waiting for headlights to sweep through the front window. I want to be precise about something before I tell you what happened. I am not, by nature, a suspicious man. I am not prone to jealousy, not given to surveillance, not the kind of husband who checks phones or interrogates absences. I had, in fact, prided myself on this. I believed that trust was not a feeling but a practice, something you chose, daily, consciously, as an act of respect for the person you had married. I had practiced it for 11 years without ever doubting it. That, I came to understand, was its own kind of blindness. My name is Nathan. I am 41 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm, the kind of work that is invisible when it succeeds and catastrophic when it fails, which is a good metaphor for more things in life than just buildings. I have been in the field for 15 years. I am competent at what I do, and I earn a salary that is comfortable without being remarkable. We own a house in a quiet part of the city. We have a son named Joel, who is 9, and a daughter named Freya, who is 6. My wife's name is Serena. Serena, 40 years old. A marketing director at a pharmaceutical company, a role she had worked toward for 7 years and reached with genuine effort and intelligence. She was, in every public and private sense, accomplished, the kind of woman who carried herself with a quiet authority that made people assume she had always had things figured out. She was also beautiful in the way that unsettles you slightly, even after 11 years, even on an ordinary Tuesday when she was just standing at the kitchen counter reading something on her phone. We had, I believed, a good marriage. Not frictionless. No marriage of 11 years is frictionless. But honest, functional, built on mutual respect and shared investment in the lives of 2 children and 1 house and 1 future. We argued occasionally about money, about the distribution of domestic labor, about the slow drift of intimacy that happens to everyone eventually. We resolved those arguments, mostly. We were, in the language people use when they mean to say they are not unhappy, fine. Then, in early September, Serena began working late. Not every night. 2, sometimes 3 nights a week. A new product launch, she said. A campaign with an aggressive timeline and a client who required significant hand-holding. She sent me messages at 7, at 8, at 9:30 that were brief and apologetic, running late. Don't wait up. Kiss the kids for me. I kissed the kids. I didn't wait up. Or I tried not to. It was Joel who first said something, in the particular way that 9-year-olds say things, directly, without drama, without any awareness of what he was handing you. Mom smells different, he said one evening, while I was helping him with a model. He was building from balsa wood and too much glue. Different how? I said. He shrugged, the way children shrug when they have offered an observation and consider their obligation fulfilled. Like a hotel, he said. I looked at the piece of balsa wood in my hands and said nothing. Like a hotel. I set the piece down carefully. I helped Joel finish the wing of the model. I read Freya her story and turned out her light and stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the house. Then I went to the kitchen and sat in the dark. And for the first time in 11 years of marriage, I let myself think the thought I had been refusing. Something was wrong. And 3 nights later at 11:45, when Serena's car finally pulled into the driveway and her key turned in the lock and she stepped into the hallway with her coat on and her hair slightly different from how it had been that morning. Not disheveled, not careless, but rearranged, as if she had been outdoors and the wind had touched it. I looked at her across the dark kitchen and she looked at me, and the half-second of something that moved across her face before she composed it into warmth and tiredness and apology was the smallest and most significant thing I had ever seen. That half-second. That was where it started. Our life, on the surface, continued. This is the thing that surprises people when they hear about betrayal. The surface endures. Breakfast happens. School runs happen. Grocery shopping and dentist appointments and the small negotiations of shared domestic space all continue, intact, unremarkable. The surface of a marriage is remarkably durable. It is the foundation that quietly fails. I watched the surface with new attention. Serena had always been organized to the point of precision. A woman who maintained a shared calendar with color-coded entries, who sent meeting invites for date nights, who had the children's school schedules memorized to a granular level. In October, the calendar began to thin. Her entries became less specific. Work dinner replaced the names of colleagues and restaurants she had previously always included. Late at office appeared where there had previously been explanations. When I asked, she answered briefly and moved to the next thing, the conversational equivalent of closing a door. I noted this without saying anything. I was still in the phase of giving the benefit of the doubt. I told myself that pressure at work was real, that the campaign she had described was real, that her distraction was the product of stress rather than distance. I told myself the story I needed to tell myself in order to function normally in the house we shared. But the sensory information kept accumulating. The perfume. Joel had said hotel, and I began to understand what he meant. Not a different perfume, Serena's own. The one I could identify in the dark. The one that had been part of my understanding of her for a decade. But applied differently, more deliberately. Not the way you put on perfume for a Tuesday at the office. The way you put it on for something that matters. The phone. It had always been accessible, present, unremarkable. Now it was charged obsessively. I noticed this because I had borrowed it once to call a number I didn't have in my own phone, and the battery had been at 93% at 10 in the evening, which meant she had charged it within the past hour. She was keeping it full the way you keep it full when you're expecting contact. The clothes. This one took me longer to name because it was subtle. Serena dressed well professionally, always had. But in October I became aware that her clothing choices for office days had shifted incrementally. Less practical. More considered. The kind of thing you notice when you've looked at someone every morning for 11 years and something changes by degrees too small to name individually but too consistent to be coincidental. I said nothing. I kept my observations private and my behavior unchanged because I understood, from some instinct I couldn't fully articulate, that changing my behavior would change hers, and changing hers would eliminate information I needed. The children continued to be the children. Joel had moved on from the balsa wood model to an obsessive interest in ancient Roman engineering, which meant the kitchen table was frequently covered in library books and printed diagrams that he narrated to me with professional confidence. I listened. I was genuinely interested, or I performed genuine interest well enough that neither of us could tell the difference. Freya had begun drawing elaborate family portraits that she presented without ceremony and taped to the refrigerator, and I noticed, over the weeks of October, that the figure she drew for Serena migrated to the edge of the compositions. Not absent, not excluded, just gradually less central. Children see what adults edit. There was a weekend in mid-October when Serena was present in a way she hadn't been for weeks. Fully present, engaged with the kids, physically affectionate with me, laughing at dinner in the genuine way I associated with the best years of our marriage. We went to the market on Saturday morning, all four of us, and she held my hand while Joel explained the structural properties of Roman aqueducts to a mildly alarmed vegetable vendor. That evening she opened a bottle of wine and we sat on the back porch after the children were in bed and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular, and it was so precisely like ourselves that I almost forgot. Almost. It was that weekend, paradoxically, that my certainty sharpened. Not because something had gone wrong, but because something was being compensated for. The warmth was real, I don't doubt that. But it was the warmth of effort, of intent, of someone who had recognized a gap and was working to close it. It had the texture of repair, and repair requires damage. That Sunday evening, while Serena was bathing Freya, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I was not close enough to read the message. I saw only the name of the contact, which was saved as a single letter, R. One letter, not a full name, not even an abbreviated name. A single letter, which is what you save someone as when you need to hide who they are. I turned away from the phone before she came back downstairs. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard in the October dark and felt the particular sensation of understanding something you cannot yet say aloud. Something that has been forming for weeks in the unlit parts of your mind and has just quietly become a shape. The name came through an unlikely channel, Freya's school art show. It was a Thursday evening in late October, a casual event in the school gymnasium, children's paintings on the walls, parents circulating with plastic cups of lukewarm coffee, teachers offering diplomatic commentary on finger-painted landscapes. Serena had come, which surprised me slightly given the pattern of recent Thursdays, and she was warm and attentive and crouched beside Freya at her painting with genuine delight. We were standing near the door when another mother, a woman named Christine whose daughter was in Freya's class, approached us with the slightly charged energy of someone who has news they're deciding whether to share. She looked at Serena with a specific expression, the polite, curious, barely contained expression of someone who has connected two things and is not sure whether she should say so, and then said, "I saw you the other week actually. On Grantham Street. You were getting into a car." A pause. "A very nice car." Serena's smile held without flickering. "That must have been someone else," she said easily. "I haven't been near Grantham Street in months." Christine looked briefly uncertain, then laughed and let it go. "My mistake," she said. "You know how it is. You see someone from the back and you're so certain." We moved on. The conversation ended. Freya showed me her painting, which depicted our family on a beach we had never visited. The sky painted an improbable and magnificent orange. I thought about Christine's expression. Not the content of what she had said, the expression. The brief hesitation before she accepted the correction. The almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes that people who are too polite to push back often produce when they know they haven't been wrong. Christine had not been wrong. Grantham Street. I knew it. The northern edge of the financial district, where the old warehouses had been converted into the kind of restaurants and private members' clubs that existed in a different economic register than anywhere I had ever taken Serena to dinner. The kind of street where very nice cars were not notable. The letter R. I began to approach this the way I approached structural problems at work. From the outside in, mapping what was visible before attempting to diagnose what was hidden. I thought about what I knew about Serena's professional world. She worked primarily with 3 major pharmaceutical clients. She had mentioned, in passing over the previous months, an expansion of one client's campaign, something that had required bringing in outside consultants, specialists in brand positioning. She had mentioned, briefly and without emphasis, a name. Not R. But in my mind, something moved. There was a man named Rowan. She had mentioned him perhaps twice in the context of the campaign, as one would mention any professional contact casually with no particular significance. I had no reason to remember the name. I remembered it now because the mind catalogs things the heart hasn't yet caught up to. I looked up the campaign she had described. It wasn't difficult. Pharmaceutical campaigns at that level have press coverage, industry reporting, professional profiles. I found the client, the campaign, the consultancy that had been brought in. And in the consultancy's leadership page, I found a name that started with R. Rowan Ashworth, 46 years old. Founder and chairman of a brand strategy firm that was itself a subsidiary of a private investment group that his family had built over 3 generations. The kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because it's been there long enough to become infrastructure. The company had offices in London, Singapore, and New York. The profile photograph showed a man with the particular composed confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether he could afford something. I sat with the screen for a long time. I want to be careful here because I was not yet certain. What I had was a sequence of observations that formed a pattern, and patterns can deceive. I had a contact saved as a single letter, a sighting on a street associated with a different economic world, a name that began with the right letter. None of this was proof. All of it was pressure. I started paying attention to the specific Thursdays. They were consistent enough now that I had named them privately as the days when I would not be given a specific explanation for lateness. I tracked them on my own calendar, not written, just mental, the way you track anything you can't afford to make visible. There was a Thursday in November when she told me she had a client dinner, that she might be very late, that I shouldn't worry. I kissed her goodbye at the door. She was wearing the dark green dress that I had always found remarkable on her, the one she reserved for events she considered important. She had her hair done in a way that required effort, the kind of effort you don't make for clients when you've worked with them for 3 years. I called her at 9:30, on a pretext, Something about Joel's permission slip for a school trip. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless, with background noise that could have been a restaurant. She was natural, warm, appropriately distracted. She said she would sign the slip in the morning and she loved me and she'd be home by 11. She came home at 12:40. I was at the kitchen table in the dark when she came in. She didn't turn on the lights immediately, and for a moment we were both in the same darkness. And in that darkness I heard her pause. "You're up," she said. "I am," I said. She turned on the lamp by the door. She looked at me with the composed face of someone who is very good at composing their face. "Late dinner," she said. "You know how these things go." "I do," I said. She made herself a glass of water and came to sit across from me, and we talked for 10 minutes about ordinary things, and she went to bed. And I sat in the dark for another hour, holding the weight of knowing and not yet saying, and feeling it press against my chest like a structural load that the building wasn't designed for. I made a decision in early November that I want to be honest about because it cost me something. I hired someone. Not dramatically, not through some noir-adjacent process, just a professional, a woman named Dana who ran a legitimate private investigations firm and whose online reviews described her as methodical and discreet. I called her on a Wednesday morning from my office with the door closed, and I told her the minimum required to convey the situation, and she quoted me a fee that was reasonable and a timeline that was honest, and I said yes. I am a man who has prided himself on doing things the right way, on directness, on transparency, on the kind of interpersonal integrity that I had always considered foundational. Hiring someone to surveil my wife felt like a violation of that self-image. I did it anyway because I had exhausted the alternative self-gathered observation, and because I understood that moving forward without certainty would cost me more than the fee. Dana was efficient. In the first week she established a routine. Serena left the office on the identified evenings not by the main entrance but through a side exit on Callaway Street, where a car, registered to a corporate account associated with Rowan Ashworth's investment group, was waiting for her. She was taken to a private members club on Grantham Street, twice. On the third occasion, she was taken to an address in the eastern part of the city that Dana identified as a residential property. A penthouse in a recently renovated building, owned through a property trust with no public-facing name but with connections, through corporate documentation, to the same investment group. Dana provided photographs. I asked her not to provide photographs of Serena in any state of intimacy. She understood without further explanation and provided what she had: arrival and departure times, vehicle details, location confirmations. The photographs showed a woman in a dark green dress entering a building that I had never seen, with a man whose profile I could match, without difficulty, to the image on a consultancy website. It was enough. More than enough. But here is where the story becomes more complicated, because Dana told me something else. Something I had not asked for, that she offered with the careful neutrality of a professional who understands that information has consequences. Serena's behavior had changed in the past 2 weeks, she said. The meetings had become less frequent. 1 confirmed contact in the past fortnight compared to 3 in the prior week. And on one occasion, Dana had observed what she described as an argument in the vehicle, visible through the window, not audible, in which Serena appeared to be the one speaking forcefully while Rowan Ashworth remained controlled and still. This complicated the picture I had been building. I had been constructing a narrative, the kind of clear, linear narrative that the mind builds when it is in pain and needs something to hold on to, in which Serena had made a straightforward choice, an unambiguous betrayal, a clear preference for a world she found more compelling than ours. The image of an argument, of Serena forceful, of Rowan still, suggested something less linear. It suggested friction, pressure, the possibility of a situation more complex than I had allowed for. I thought about this for several days without acting on it. I also thought about Freya's drawings, in which Serena had migrated to the edge of the composition, and about Joel's comment, like a hotel, and about the weekend in mid-October when Serena had been so deliberately present that it felt like compensation, and about the single letter on the phone, and the dark green dress, and the 12:40 return. And I thought about a conversation we had had 3 months before any of this, a conversation I had almost forgotten. We had been sitting in the backyard on a warm evening in July, and Serena had been quiet for a long time, and then she had said, without preamble, "Do you ever feel like we stopped growing?" I had asked what she meant. She had said she wasn't sure, that it was probably just work stress, that it was nothing. I had accepted that. I had practiced my trust and gone back to my book and let the evening close over the question without examining it. I had been given an opening and I had not walked through it. I am not saying this to assign blame to myself for what she did. I'm saying it because it is true, and because the true version of a story is more useful than the comfortable version. There was also the matter of her colleague Marcus. Marcus was a man I had met twice at firm events. Serena's age, affable, vaguely familiar with the ease of someone who had always had options. He had called our house once, in early October, on the landline, which almost nobody called, and when I had told Serena about the call, she had been briefly, unmistakably startled before composing herself and saying he sometimes called the landline when her mobile went to voicemail. I had initially flagged Marcus as a possible secondary suspicion, the way the mind multiplies its concerns when it is already worried. Dana had looked into him as a matter of course and found nothing relevant. He was apparently exactly who he appeared to be, a colleague. But his call had been 3 days before I first noticed the R on her phone. A detail. A small, unresolved detail that I filed away without conclusion. Then, in the second week of November, Serena told me she needed to attend a conference in another city. 2 nights. She showed me the registration confirmation on her laptop. A legitimate conference, a real event, the kind she attended annually. She showed me the hotel reservation. She was prepared, detailed, transparent in a way that was itself slightly alarming. I showed the conference details to Dana. Serena was registered for the conference. She attended the first day. She did not sleep at the hotel she had shown me. She slept at a property registered to the same trust as the penthouse. She attended the second day of the conference and came home on the scheduled flight. She came home with a gift for Freya, a small painted ceramic figure from a market near the conference venue. She had bought it, which meant part of her was always thinking about the children even in the middle of the worst of it. I held that detail for a long time. I chose a Saturday morning. The children were at my mother's for the weekend. She had taken them for what she called a grandmother weekend, a regular occurrence that the children treated as a minor holiday and that I had, this time, quietly arranged to fall on a specific date. Serena was in the kitchen making coffee when I came downstairs. She had her hair tied back and she was wearing a sweater I had given her the previous Christmas. Something blue that she had worn often enough to tell me she genuinely liked it. She looked ordinary and familiar and like herself, which was the hardest version of her to be in this moment. I sat down at the table. "I need to talk to you," I said. She turned from the coffee. She looked at me with the quiet attention of someone who has been half expecting this and has not decided yet how to meet it. She didn't speak. "I know about Rowan," I said. The silence that followed was the shape of something changing. She set down the mug very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands might not be fully reliable. She sat across from me. She did not perform surprise. She did not produce immediate denial or justification. She looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as the face of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has just been told they can put it down. "How long?" she said. "Long enough," I said. "How much do you know?" "Everything that matters," I said. "I want you to tell me the rest." She told me. It had started in August, earlier than I had estimated, which meant the shift in her I had noticed in September was already a correction, already a performance of normalcy over something that had been building for weeks. A working dinner, a conversation that ran longer than it should have, a follow-up that was nominally professional and became something else before either of them had named it. Rowan had, she said, pursued her with a particular kind of deliberate attention that she found, and she paused here, choosing her words, overwhelming. Not in the way of pressure, but in the way of focus. He was a man who was accustomed to directing his attention at things he wanted and having the world rearrange itself accordingly. He had told her things. "What things?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. "He told me I was wasted," she said. Those were the actual words. That everything I had built, my career, my life, was capable of being so much more with the right resources, the right environment. She paused. "He said he could give me a different life." "A different life," I repeated. "Yes, I thought about that. And did you want it?" The silence was its own answer. But she gave me the spoken one too. I wanted to want it, she said. That's the honest answer. I wanted to want the version of things he was describing. There were moments when I thought, yes, this is what I should have been doing. This is the version of myself that got left behind somewhere. A pause. And then I would come home and Freya would show me a drawing and I would feel sick. But you kept going back. Yes, she said. I kept going back. I asked about the argument Dana had observed. She looked briefly startled. A confirmation that she hadn't fully accounted for how much I knew, and then she told me. 3 weeks ago, she had told Rowan that she needed to step back, that she had 2 children, that what he was offering was a fantasy that required her to become someone she wasn't sure she was or wanted to be. He had not accepted this well. He was, she said, a man unaccustomed to being told no, and his response had been the controlled, cold displeasure of someone who has always believed that the right offer, made at the right moment, will eventually produce the right result. He said the offer wasn't permanent, she said, that I should think carefully. And did you? Yes, she said. I thought very carefully. She looked at me directly. I'm telling you now. I wanted to believe this. Part of me did believe it. Part of me understood that the argument, the stepping back, the return, these were real events, not performances constructed for my benefit. But I also understood that the architecture of what had happened was not undone by its most recent chapter. Nathan, she said, I am so sorry. I know, I said. I don't know what I was trying to find. I think I stopped believing that what we had was enough, and instead of telling you that, I looked for it somewhere else. That's the truth. That's the worst version of it, and I'm not going to dress it up. We talked for 3 hours. Not fighting, not in the way I might have expected. There were moments of real anger, mine, expressed with the measured intensity of someone who has held it for weeks and is finally allowing it to exist, and she received it without defense, which was either the best or most difficult thing she could have done. There were moments of genuine grief on both sides. There were silences that said more than the words surrounding them. I asked about Marcus. She looked confused, briefly, and then said he had nothing to do with any of this. He had called on the landline because she hadn't answered her mobile and he had needed a file path for a shared document. A mundane explanation for a detail I had inflated in my anxiety. This was the red herring that the mind builds when it is searching for patterns. Not every anomaly is connected to the central damage. Near the end of the conversation, I told her about Freya's drawings. She closed her eyes. The edge of the composition, I said. I know, she said. I know what I've been. I told her about Joel's comment, like a hotel. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different. He's 9 years old, she said. And he noticed. He noticed. I confirmed. We didn't reach conclusions that morning. We didn't make decisions about the future or the house or the children or the 11 years of marriage that had brought us to a Saturday in November sitting across a kitchen table with cold coffee between us. Those decisions came later, slowly, painfully, with the help of a therapist who specialized in exactly this kind of fracture and who had the patience to let us be slow. What we reached on that morning was the truth. The complete, unvarnished, bilateral truth, hers about what she had done, mine about what I had missed, both of us about the July conversation in the backyard when she had asked whether we had stopped growing and I had let the question close over without answering it. That was the moment, she said. That was when I needed you to ask more. I know, I said. I know that now. What happens after truth is not always clean. People who have not been through a marriage fracture often imagine it one of 2 ways: dramatic collapse or dramatic reconciliation. The reality is neither. The reality is long, ordinary, and requires sustained effort from people who are genuinely exhausted and not sure they have it. We decided, after 6 weeks of the kind of careful, difficult conversation that the therapist helped us navigate, to try not to pretend nothing had happened. The therapist was clear that pretending was both impossible and counterproductive, but to investigate honestly whether what remained was enough to build on. Whether the marriage we had allowed to become invisible to both of us could become visible again. This was not a romantic decision. It was a practical one, made by 2 people who loved their children and respected each other enough to find out whether what they had left was real. It had the quality of a building assessment. Not assuming the structure is safe, not assuming it's beyond repair, but doing the work of finding out. Rowan Ashworth, to his credit or simply to his indifference, did not attempt contact after Serena ended things definitively. He was, apparently, the kind of man who moved on efficiently when a situation no longer served him, which told me something about the nature of what he had offered Serena, and told me she had, even in the months of the affair, been learning this about him. The different life he had promised was real in the sense that money is real. It was not real in the sense that anything built on a foundation of someone else's loneliness and willingness to be reshaped would have lasted. Serena understood this. She had been in the process of understanding it before I confronted her. I don't find comfort in this exactly, but I find truth in it, which is a different and more useful thing. We were harder on ourselves than on each other, which the therapist said was both a good sign and its own problem. Serena carried guilt in a way that occasionally became self-punishment rather than productive reflection, and the therapist worked with her on the distinction. I carried a version of what I can only describe as professional shame, the sense that I had failed to detect something I should have detected, that my self-image as someone attentive and emotionally present had been contradicted by 11 years of practiced inattention to the specific things Serena needed. I had been present. I had simply been present in the wrong directions. The July conversation never left me. That evening in the backyard, the wine and the warm air and her question, "Do you ever feel like we stopped growing?" And my practiced trust, my comfortable acceptance of her self-correction. I had heard the question and chosen not to follow it. That was my failure, specific and mine, independent of everything she had done after. Joel came home from his grandmother's weekend with a Roman aqueduct reproduction he had built from cardboard and a detailed explanation of why it would, theoretically, function. I sat with him at the table and listened to the engineering and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was close to ordinary. Freya came home with a drawing she had made at her grandmother's house. A family portrait. All four of us in the center of the page this time, the sky the same improbable orange as the beach painting at the art show. Serena was standing next to me, drawn with the particular accuracy that children achieve when they are paying attention. Freya presented it without ceremony and asked if we had crackers. We had crackers. Life is like that. It moves on in crackers and cardboard aqueducts and orange skies while you are still trying to find solid ground beneath your feet. By spring, we had made progress, real, measurable, imperfect progress. The kind of progress that doesn't look like a transformation from the outside but feels, from the inside, like the difference between sinking and swimming. We were honest with each other in ways we hadn't been for years, about needs, about fears, about the specific loneliness that each of us had been carrying privately in the same house. This was not comfortable. It was, however, real. I did not forgive easily. I want to be honest about that. There were evenings when I looked at Serena across the table and felt the October Thursdays with an intensity that I had not expected would persist so long. There were moments when I was short with her in ways I regretted and that I apologized for, and moments when the grief simply had to sit in the room without resolution. Forgiveness, I came to understand, is not an event but a practice. Something you do again and again, imperfectly, toward a destination you approach without ever entirely arriving. I went back to work and did my job, which requires attention to the invisible load-bearing structures of things. I found gradually that the parallel was useful. Every structure has hidden stresses. Every building carries loads that don't announce themselves until they are already near their limit. The engineer's job is not to prevent all stress but to design for it honestly, to know where the weight is, to build for what is actually true rather than what you would prefer to be true. I had not designed my marriage for what was actually true. I had built it for what I assumed to be true, which is a different thing and a more dangerous one. That was my lesson. Not that I had failed, but that I had been building with assumptions rather than materials. The house is still ours. The children are still ours. The marriage is still ours, in a form that is less familiar and more honest than what it was a year ago. Some days that feel like enough. Some days it feels like more. The relationship between Nathan and Serena doesn't collapse because of Rowan Ashworth. It collapses because of a July evening in the backyard when a question was left unanswered. This is the story's central psychological truth. The affair was not the cause of the fracture, but the visible symptom of a structural failure that had been developing, unaddressed, long before Rowan entered the picture. Serena's motivations are complex in the way that real human motivations are complex. Not simply greed, not simply boredom, but a particular combination of unmet need, suppressed ambition, and the intoxicating specificity of being seen by someone who made seeing you his deliberate project. Rowan Ashworth is a man whose wealth is, among other things, a vehicle for a particular kind of attention, focused, resourced, consequential. For a woman who had been asking whether she was still growing and receiving comfortable non-answers, that attention was not simply flattery. It was evidence that someone had noticed the question she was carrying. This does not make what she did right. It makes it comprehensible, which is different and more useful for understanding. Nathan's response pattern throughout the story reveals a man whose professional competence and personal restraint are the same thing deployed in different theaters. He observes before acting. He gathers evidence before drawing conclusions. He maintains composure while carrying significant weight. These qualities serve him in his investigation and protect his children during an unstable period. They are also precisely the qualities that made him difficult to reach emotionally. The man who practices trust without examining it, who hears a question in the backyard and lets it pass. Would you have heard that question? Would you have recognized it as a turning point? In retrospect, it seems obvious. In the moment, during a warm evening in July with nothing visibly wrong, it probably didn't feel like anything at all. The children function as the story's emotional conscience. Joel names something, the hotel smell, that adults have been trained to not name. Freya's drawings map the emotional geography of the family with the accuracy of someone who has not yet learned to edit her perceptions. Both observations are data points that Nathan registers and that collectively construct an emotional portrait of a family in a process of quiet fracture. The key lesson here is not about surveillance or investigation. It is about the question Nathan didn't ask in July. The lesson is that emotional transparency is not a feeling. It is a practice, like trust, that requires consistent active maintenance. When Serena stopped believing their marriage was growing, the failure was not hers alone. The failure was the shared one of two people who had allowed their communication to become a surface performance of normalcy rather than an honest account of where they actually were. What this story asks us to consider is the relationship between comfort and complacency. How the same stability that makes a marriage feel secure can, over time, make it feel static. Serena's affair with Rowan was, at its core, a search for motion. She had stopped believing in the possibility of growth within her marriage, and rather than naming this clearly, she found an external source of the feeling she was missing. The self-deception that enabled everything was not primarily Serena's. It was shared. Both Nathan and Serena had built an internal narrative in which the marriage was fine. Not flourishing, not in active repair, just fine. And that narrative protected them from the uncomfortable work of asking harder questions. Nathan's practiced trust was, from a certain angle, a practiced avoidance. If he didn't look too closely, he wouldn't have to respond to what he found. The point of no return was not the affair. It was the moment Serena began building infrastructure to sustain it, the edited calendar, the single letter on the phone, the rehearsed explanations. At that point, she had made a series of consecutive choices to prioritize the new situation over the existing one, and the cumulative weight of those choices was what Nathan eventually had to carry alongside the betrayal itself. That they rebuilt is not a triumph of love over difficulty. It is a decision made in full knowledge of the damage to build something more honest than what existed before. The value of that is not that it undoes what happened. It is that it refuses to let what happened be the final definition of who they are. What I keep returning to in this story is Nathan's memory of that July evening. The question Serena asked, "Do you ever feel like we stopped growing?" And the comfortable answer that closed it. There is something painfully familiar about that moment. Not because most of us are in affairs or have been betrayed, but because most of us have heard a question like that from someone we love and chosen the easier path. We let it close over. We tell ourselves it was stress, tiredness, a passing mood. We practice our trust and go back to our books. The hard truth this story leaves with me is that love is not enough on its own. It has to be accompanied by attention, real attention, the kind that asks the uncomfortable follow-up question and sits with the uncomfortable answer. The kind that doesn't just trust but stays curious about the person it trusts. Can a marriage survive something like this? Sometimes. But only if both people are willing to stop building with assumptions and start building with what is actually true. That is harder than it sounds. It is also the only way that works.